A German sergeant stands frozen in a Kansas mess hall. He points a trembling finger at a table. The table is laden with platters of pot roast, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. He believes it is a propaganda photograph. He thinks the tables are decorated for a picture. 1943, Camp Concordia, Kansas, a place of unimaginable abundance. This is the story of how simple American food became a psychological weapon that broke the spirit of Nazi Germany's most hardened soldiers. May 1943, Camp Concordia, Kansas. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter stepped off the train and into a wall of heat. The air was thick with the smell of dust and dry grass, a scent so different from the metallic tang of cordite and the cloying sweetness of decay that had defined his world for 3 years. He and the others, remnants of the legendary Africa Corps, were shadows of men. Their uniforms hung on skeletal frames. Their skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over cheekbones. They were survivors of a war of scarcity. They understood hunger. It was a language spoken in hollowed eyes and gaunt faces, a constant companion from the icy plains of Russia to the blistering sands of Tunisia. They marched under the watchful eyes of young American guards, boys barely old enough to shave, whose cheeks were full and whose movements were languid with energy. The prisoners' steps were shuffling, economical. Every calorie was a treasure hoarded against a tomorrow that was certain to be as bleak as yesterday. They were marched into a long wooden barrack, a dining hall. The scent that hit them was confusing. It was not the thin, sour smell of cabbage soup or the gritty aroma of ersatz bread made with sawdust. It was rich, savory. It smelled of meat, of baking bread, of home, but a home none of them could remember. They filed past a serving line holding metal trays. American cooks, large men in white aprons, moved with a casual efficiency that bordered on indifference. A scoop of mashed potatoes, thick and white, landed on Klaus's tray with a heavy thud. He stared at it. Then a slice of pot roast, dark and glistening, its juices pooling around the potatoes, a ladle of brown gravy, a pat of bright yellow butter for a thick slice of white bread. Real butter, not margarine, not rendered fat. Butter. His hand, the one that had held a Luger with steady precision, trembled slightly. At the end of the line was the final impossibility, a slice of apple pie. The crust was golden brown, sprinkled with sugar. Klaus watched as the man in front of him, a battle-hardened Feldwebel named Schmidt, stopped dead. Schmidt stared at his own tray, then at the tables where other prisoners were beginning to sit. He turned to the nearest American guard, a young corporal chewing gum. "For the photograph?" Schmidt asked in broken English, pointing at the food. "Is propaganda, yes?" The corporal paused his chewing, a look of genuine confusion on his face. "Propaganda? What are you talking about, Fritz? It's dinner. Now move along." Schmidt did not move. He looked at the rows of tables, each set with identical, impossibly large meals. "No," he insisted, his voice a dry rasp. "This is not food. This is for decoration, for a picture to show the world." The American guard simply laughed, a sound that was not cruel, just uncomprehending. He nudged Schmidt forward. "Eat up, Sergeant. There's more where that came from." Klaus Richter found a seat at a long wooden table. The men around him were silent. The usual barracks chatter, the cynical jokes, the muttered complaints, all were gone. The only sound was the scrape of forks against metal trays. They ate with a desperate, mechanical intensity, their eyes darting around, as if expecting the food to be snatched away at any moment. They did not savor it. They consumed it. It was fuel, a miracle of sustenance they could not comprehend. Klaus watched as men surreptitiously wrapped their slice of bread in a napkin, tucking it into a pocket. He saw another man scoop the pat of butter into a small tin he produced from his tunic. They were acting on instinct, the instinct of the starved. This bounty was an anomaly, a trick. It could not last. Tomorrow the gruel and black bread would return. It had to. This was war. Klaus looked down at his own tray. He had finished the meat and potatoes. The butter was gone, melted into the soft, yielding bread. Only the apple pie remained. He picked up his fork and cut into it. The aroma of cinnamon and baked apples filled his senses. It was a flavor from a different life, from a world before the war, a world he was no longer sure had ever existed. He took a bite. It was sweet. It was real. And in that moment, for the first time since his capture, Klaus Richter felt a flicker of something more terrifying than fear. He felt dread. Not the dread of the enemy, but the dread of what this simple meal represented. He was a prisoner, an enemy of the state, and he was being fed a meal better than any he had eaten as a decorated officer on the front lines. The thought was so disorienting, so fundamentally wrong, that he had to set his fork down. The war, he suspected with a sudden, chilling certainty, was already over. He just hadn't known it yet. A slice of pie appeared. It sat on his tray. Klaus Richter's hand stopped moving, his gaze fixed on the golden crust, the thick filling. A single slice held more sugar and fat than a week of his front-line rations. He expected hunger. He saw dessert. The first days at Camp Concordia unfolded in a haze of disbelief. The prisoners' internal clocks, tuned to the rhythms of scarcity, were shattered. They awoke each morning with the gnawing expectation of hunger, only to be met with the smell of frying bacon, scrambled eggs, and fresh coffee. They lined up for breakfast, their faces a mixture of suspicion and desperate hope. And each time, the miracle repeated. There were eggs. There was meat. There were pancakes with syrup. There was milk, cold and fresh, something most of them hadn't tasted in years. This daily ritual became a form of psychological warfare, more effective than any leaflet drop or broadcast. It was a silent, relentless assault on their entire worldview. In the Third Reich, sacrifice was virtue. Scarcity was a sign of national discipline. Every German citizen, from the housewife in Berlin to the soldier in Normandy, understood the calculus of rationing. Life was a matter of grams and calories, of making do, of turning potato peels into soup and acorns into coffee. Their entire national effort was built on the meticulous management of scarcity. Here, in the middle of the Kansas prairie, that logic was inverted. The Americans operated on a principle so alien it felt like it came from another planet: abundance. Not just abundance, but a casual, almost careless surplus. The prisoners, conditioned by years of propaganda depicting America as a decadent, internally collapsing society, could not reconcile the image with the reality. Where were the starving masses? Where was the societal decay? All they saw were healthy guards, endless supplies and food, mountains of it. The scarcity mentality was a stubborn beast. For the first few weeks, the hoarding continued. Barracks inspections would turn up caches of dried bread, lumps of butter wrapped in paper, and tins of preserved meat, all pilfered from the mess hall. The American camp commander, Colonel John Miller, was baffled. He consulted with the camp's intelligence officers. Were the prisoners planning an escape? Was this some kind of protest? An interpreter, a German-American captain from Wisconsin named Bauer, tried to explain. "Colonel, they don't believe it will last," Bauer said, standing in Miller's sparse office. "In their world, if you have something today, you save it, because tomorrow you will have nothing." They have been trained for years to think this way. It's not insubordination, it's survival. Miller, a practical man who had run a hardware business before the war, found the concept difficult to grasp. Survival? We're feeding them over 3,200 calories a day. The Geneva Convention only requires a ration equivalent to a base camp soldier. We're exceeding that by 1,000 calories. "Sir, with all due respect, they don't understand the Geneva Convention," Bauer replied. "They understand a loaf of bread, and they believe that loaf is the last one they'll see for a week." So the camp staff began a subtle re-education campaign. They made no announcements. They simply continued to provide the food day after day with unwavering consistency. The cooks were instructed to make it clear that there was always more in the kitchen. If a man finished his portion and wanted another, he got it. No questions asked. At first, no one dared. To ask for more was to tempt fate, to call attention to the impossible surplus. Then, one morning, a young private named Eric Schmidt, a boy of 19 who had been captured near Tunis, finished his pancakes and eggs and remained seated staring at his empty plate. He was still hungry. He had been hungry for 2 years. His stomach was a hollow pit that no single meal could fill. He watched the other prisoners file out. Finally, mustering a courage he hadn't felt since his last firefight, he walked back to the serving line. He held out his tray to the big American cook. "Bitte?" "More?" he whispered. The cook, a hefty man named Sergeant O'Malley, looked down at the skinny German kid. He didn't understand the word, but he understood the gesture. Without a word, he turned, grabbed the spatula, and slid 2 more pancakes and another scoop of eggs onto the boy's tray. He even added another sausage link. "There you go, kid," O'Malley grunted. "Eat up." Eric stood there for a second, stunned. He looked at the food, then at the cook. He scurried back to his table, his heart pounding. Every eye in the mess hall was on him. He ate the second helping, slowly this time. When he was done, he was full. Truly full, for the first time he could remember. He hadn't just received more food. He had received a confirmation. The food was not a trick. The supply was, it seemed, endless. That small act of defiance broke the dam. The next day, 12 men went back for seconds. The day after, 50. The hoarding began to subside. The stashes of stale bread in the barracks grew smaller. The men's bodies began to change. The gaunt, haunted look in their eyes was slowly replaced by a healthier sheen. Skin lost its sallow color. The hollows in their cheeks began to fill out. They were gaining weight, an average of 2 to 3 pounds a week. Their German-issued uniforms grew tight, the seams straining. The Americans had to issue them new clothing, standard U.S. Army fatigue pants and shirts, further stripping away the last vestiges of their former identity. They were being physically rebuilt in the image of their captors. Klaus Richter watched this transformation with the analytical eye of a logistics officer. He saw more than just improving health. He saw a psychological surrender taking place. The first sign was subtle, but to him it was as loud as an artillery barrage. It was the bread. For weeks, not a single slice of bread was ever left on a tray. To waste bread was a cardinal sin in Germany, a crime against the Volk. It was the staff of life, the symbol of sustenance. Then one evening, he saw it. A prisoner finished his meal, stood up, and left his tray. On the tray, next to a clean-licked plate, was half a slice of bread. Untouched, it was a revolutionary act. It was a declaration of faith. Faith that morning would come. Faith that the kitchen would still be there. Faith that the cooks would still be serving. Faith that the trucks would keep arriving, laden with supplies from the vast, mythical interior of a continent they were just beginning to comprehend. Leaving bread on the plate was an admission of defeat. It was the quiet acknowledgement that the foundation of their entire world, the nobility of scarcity, was a lie. If the sight of a half-eaten slice of bread was a quiet surrender, the true breaking point for Klaus Richter was something far more visceral. It was an event that occurred not with a bang, but with the clatter of a metal lid. It happened on a sweltering afternoon in late July, about 2 months after their arrival. The initial shock of the food had worn off, replaced by a kind of numb, routine acceptance. The men had settled into the rhythm of camp life, morning roll call, work details, meals, inspections, sleep. They were beginning to look less like prisoners of war and more like farm hands. Their arms were tanned from the Kansas sun, and their movements had a newfound strength. But beneath the surface, the psychological calculus was still churning. Klaus was assigned to a detail cleaning the area behind the main mess hall. It was unpleasant work, but it was better than sitting in the barracks, lost in thought. He was sweeping the dusty ground when a pair of American guards emerged from the kitchen's back door. They were carrying 2 large galvanized steel garbage cans between them. They grunted with the effort. The cans were clearly heavy. Klaus paused his sweeping, leaning on his broom. He watched as they hauled the cans over to a designated spot a few yards away. He assumed they were full of potato peels, coffee grounds, bones, the usual kitchen refuse. Then one of the guards, a young private with red hair, lifted the lid off the first can, and tipped it into a larger disposal bin. What spilled out was not garbage. Klaus Richter's breath caught in his throat. His knuckles, wrapped around the broom handle, turned white. It was bread, loaves of it. Some were whole, untouched. Others were the ends of loaves, thick and crusty. There were dozens of them. Mixed in with the bread were chunks of roasted meat, heaps of boiled potatoes, and what looked like an entire tray of macaroni and cheese, barely touched. It was a mountain of perfectly edible food. Food that in Germany would have been fought over, treasured, rationed out to feed a dozen families for a week. The second can was tipped over. More food cascaded out. Vegetables, pies with only one or two slices missing, whole sausages. The red-haired guard kicked a stray potato back into the bin, then slammed the empty cans down. He wiped the sweat from his brow and said something to his companion. They both laughed. Klaus felt a cold rage building in his chest, an indignation so profound it made him dizzy. This was not just waste. This was a desecration. It was an insult to every hungry child in Hamburg, to every starving soldier in the Wehrmacht, to his own family, who he knew were subsisting on ration cards and hope. He took a step forward, his mind racing. He had to say something. This had to be a mistake, a grotesque, unforgivable mistake. He approached the guards, his heart hammering. He searched for the right English words. "Why?" he asked, his voice strained. He pointed a shaking finger at the bin overflowing with food. "Why you do this?" The red-haired guard turned, his expression one of mild surprise. He didn't seem to understand the question. "Do what?" "The food," Klaus said, gesturing more emphatically. "This is good food, not garbage." The guard looked at the bin, then back at Klaus. He shrugged, a gesture of complete, untroubled indifference. "It's leftovers from lunch. Mess sergeant's orders. We throw it out every day. Got to make room for dinner." The two words hit Klaus with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a one-time error. This was policy. This was routine. This was normal. He stared into the bin again, and this time he didn't just see discarded food. He saw a system of such overwhelming, profligate abundance that it could afford to throw away more food in a single day than his own regiment in Russia had seen in a month. He thought of the meticulous calculations he and his fellow officers used to perform, counting every crate of hardtack, rationing every tin of meat, dividing sacks of potatoes down to the individual soldier. They were masters of scarcity logistics. Their entire military machine, the one that had conquered a continent, was built on the principle of making a little go a very long way. And here, the Americans weren't managing scarcity. They were managing surplus. They had so much they had to create systems to dispose of it efficiently. In that moment, standing under the blazing Kansas sun, the smell of wasted food filling his nostrils, Klaus Richter understood. The war was not a contest of ideology or tactics or even courage. It was a war of production, of logistics, of factories and farms. It was a war between a nation that counted every bullet and every potato and a nation that threw away bread by the loaf. And you could not win a war against a people who could afford to do that. You just couldn't. He looked at the young American guard, who was now lighting a cigarette, completely oblivious to the existential crisis he had just induced. The guard was not his enemy. He was just a cog in a machine so vast, so powerful, that it didn't even recognize Klaus's entire world of struggle and sacrifice as anything more than a minor inconvenience. "It is just garbage?" Klaus asked, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "Yeah," the guard said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Just garbage." Klaus Richter turned and walked back to his broom. He did not say another word. The rage had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow certainty. The spirit of the Afrika Korps had not been broken in the deserts of El Alamein or the beaches of Tunis. For him, it died right there, next to a garbage bin in the middle of America. It had been defeated by a pile of leftover bread. The revelation by the garbage cans was not an emotional outburst. It was a data point. For Klaus Richter, a man who thought in terms of supply lines and tonnage, that pile of wasted food was the most important piece of intelligence he had ever gathered. That night, he could not sleep. The image of the discarded bread was burned into his mind. It wasn't the waste that haunted him now, but the cold, hard logic of it. He acquired a pencil stub and a few scraps of paper. By the dim light of the barracks, he began to calculate. He was a prisoner with no access to official records, but he had his own observations. He started with the food. He estimated the daily caloric intake per prisoner at roughly 3,200 calories. He multiplied that by the number of prisoners in the camp, which he knew to be around 4,000. That was 12.8 million calories per day, just for the German prisoners. He then factored in the American staff, whom he assumed were fed even better. He added the waste. He conservatively estimated that at least 15 to 20% of the food was discarded. He thought about the logistics. The train that brought them here. It was a dedicated train. He thought of the constant stream of supply trucks he saw entering the camp gates every morning. They carried not just food, but fresh linen, medical supplies, construction materials, fuel. He put the pencil to paper. His mind raced. 4,000 prisoners, 3,200 calories each, plus guards, plus waste. His hand trembled as he wrote the final number. The food for this one camp, for one day, could have sustained an entire German division on the Eastern Front for 3 days. The war wasn't a fight, it was an equation, and he was on the wrong side of it. He sat back, staring at the numbers. They told a story more devastating than any battle report. Germany's entire war effort was a masterpiece of efficiency born of desperation. They had re-engineered their economy to squeeze every last ounce of production from a finite pool of resources. They had conquered nations to seize their oil fields, their factories, their farmlands. And it was all for nothing. America wasn't squeezing, it was overflowing. What he was experiencing at Camp Concordia was not an anomaly. It was the system working as intended. The food he was eating, the clothes he was wearing, the barracks he was sleeping in. They were not a drain on the American war effort. They were a rounding error. A country that could feed its enemies this well, while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple fronts, arming its allies through the Lend-Lease Act, and maintaining a high standard of living for its civilian population, was not a country you could defeat in a war of attrition. It was a mathematical impossibility. This intellectual surrender was soon followed by a far more personal and agonizing one. Mail from home began to arrive, heavily censored but still carrying whispers from a world that now seemed a million miles away. Klaus received his first letter from his wife, Anneliese, in early September. He tore it open with trembling fingers, desperate for news. He read the letter once, quickly. Then he read it again, slowly, the words branding themselves into his memory. She wrote about their children, their health, the news from the neighborhood. But threaded throughout the letter was a narrative he now understood with horrifying clarity. "The potato ration was cut again last week," she wrote. "We are all getting very creative with turnips. Young Klaus asks every day when you are coming home, and if you will bring back some real chocolate. I tell him you are fighting bravely for the fatherland." In another paragraph, she mentioned, "Frau Schmidt next door was so happy. Her brother in the countryside managed to send her a sack of flour. She cried when she saw it. We will have real bread for a week." The letter lay flat on his bunk. Klaus's eyes locked on a single sentence. "We celebrated your birthday with a special soup made from potato peels." His stomach dropped. That morning, for his own breakfast, he had eaten 2 eggs, 3 sausages, and pancakes with maple syrup. The shame was a physical weight. It crushed the air from his lungs. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket. He walked out of the barracks and stood in the yard, looking out at the endless flatness of the Kansas prairie. The sky was a vast, indifferent blue. He felt a profound and agonizing sense of dislocation. He was an enemy soldier, a prisoner. Yet he was living a life of material comfort that would be the envy of a general in his own country. He was eating like a king while his wife was boiling potato peels and his son was dreaming of a piece of chocolate. The weight he had gained, the 30 pounds that filled out his uniform, suddenly felt disgusting. It was a mark of shame. Every pound was a testament to his family's hunger. Every full meal was a betrayal. The German propaganda had spoken of sacrifice, of a glorious shared struggle. But the struggle was not shared. He, the captured warrior, was safe and well fed. They, the civilians at home, were bearing the true burden of the war he had fought. This feeling of shame spread through the camp like a virus. As more letters arrived, the men would share the news. Rations cut, bombing raids destroying supply depots, the constant grinding struggle for basic sustenance. They would read these letters in the evening after having eaten a dinner of fried chicken or beef stew, and a heavy silence would fall over the barracks. The food, which had at first been a source of shock and then of comfort, now became a source of guilt. It was a daily reminder of the chasm that had opened up between their lives and the lives of their loved ones. They had been spared the final brutal years of the war, but in their place they were given this strange, comfortable torment. They had been defeated not by bullets or bombs, but by butter and bread and an enemy whose greatest weapon was a generosity so vast it felt like contempt. If you are finding this account of history as surprising as the soldiers who lived it, a simple click on the like button helps us know you want more stories like this brought out of the shadows. Now back to the fields of Kansas. The psychological transformation was mirrored by a physical one. By the winter of 1944, the men of Camp Concordia were unrecognizable from the wraiths who had arrived a year earlier. They had gained, on average, 30 to 40 pounds. Their faces were full, their skin healthy. When new shipments of prisoners arrived direct from the collapsing fronts in Europe, the contrast was staggering. The new arrivals were gaunt, shell-shocked, and starving. They looked at the veteran prisoners of Concordia with suspicion and awe. They couldn't believe these healthy, robust men were German soldiers. One of the camp's policies, designed both to keep the prisoners occupied and to alleviate wartime labor shortages in the U.S., was to allow them to work on local farms. For a nominal wage of 80 cents a day, paid in camp scrip they could use at the post exchange, the prisoners would be bussed out to the surrounding farms to help with the harvest. For Klaus Richter, this experience was the final overwhelming chapter in his re-education. The first time he rode in the back of a truck through the Kansas countryside, he was struck by the emptiness. The sheer scale of the land was difficult to process. In Germany, every square meter of arable land was precious, meticulously cultivated. Here, vast fields of wheat and corn stretched to the horizon, interrupted only by a solitary farmhouse or a line of trees. There were no villages clustered together for protection, no ancient stone walls dividing one family's plot from another. There was only land, endless and fertile. He was assigned to a farm owned by a man named Henderson, a quiet, weathered farmer in his 60s whose 2 sons were fighting in the Pacific. Henderson treated the prisoners not with hostility, but with a kind of practical detachment. They were here to do a job, and as long as they did it, he was content. What shocked Klaus was not the work itself, but the machinery. Henderson, with the help of just one hired hand and a dozen prisoners, farmed an acreage that would have required a whole village in Bavaria. He had a modern John Deere tractor that did the work of 20 men, a combine harvester that cut and threshed the wheat in a single pass, and a truck to haul the grain to a silo that seemed to Klaus to be the size of a cathedral. Henderson's wife came out at midday. She carried a large pitcher. From it she poured glasses of iced lemonade, beaded with condensation. Her hand stopped at Klaus. She handed him not just the drink, but a sandwich thick with ham and cheese. It wasn't a ration. It wasn't a reward. It was just a sandwich. The casual generosity was more disarming than any interrogation. This was the American arsenal of democracy, not in a factory, but in the soil. It was a system of agricultural production so efficient it could feed its own nation, its armies, its allies, and its prisoners, and still have a surplus. Klaus realized that the German concept of Lebensraum, or living space, the ideological justification for their eastward expansion to seize the fertile lands of Ukraine, was a pathetic fantasy. Germany had sought to conquer a few million acres while America had a whole continent and the industrial power to exploit it effortlessly. The prisoners would talk about this in the evenings. The conversations had changed. The old boasts about German technical superiority, about the Tiger tank or the Messerschmitt fighter, faded away. They were replaced by discussions of crop yields, tractor horsepower, and logistics. They were soldiers, but they now spoke the language of farmers and quartermasters. "Did you see the number of cattle on Henderson's farm?" one man would say. "Hundreds, just for beef." "And the pigs," another would add. "He feeds them corn. In Germany, we would use that corn to make bread." Klaus listened to these conversations, recognizing the slow, dawning comprehension in their voices. They were all performing the same grim calculus he had. They were all coming to the same conclusion. They were not just prisoners. They were witnesses to the very source of their nation's defeat. They were living inside the engine room of their enemy. This knowledge created a strange new dynamic. The will to resist, to maintain a defiant military bearing, evaporated. What was the point? Sabotaging a tractor or working slowly on a farm felt like throwing a pebble at a mountain. It was a futile gesture against a force that was not so much military as it was elemental. The guards, in turn, relaxed. The relationship between captor and captive became less adversarial. The prisoners were, for the most part, compliant and hard-working. There were few escape attempts from Concordia. After all, where would they go? Every direction they could run, they would only find more of the same. More farms, more food, more evidence of the impossible, crushing abundance that had already defeated them. By the spring of 1945, the news from Europe grew more and more dire. The prisoners would read the camp newsletters, which posted translations of wire reports. The Rhine had been crossed. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin. The great cities of the Reich, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, were being reduced to rubble. For the men in Kansas, it felt like reading about a different planet. Their world was one of peaceful, sun-drenched fields, 3 meals a day, and clean sheets. The cognitive dissonance was immense. They felt a growing sense of helplessness and guilt, but also a strange, unspoken relief. They had lost the war, but they had survived. The day the news of Germany's final surrender came, on May 8, 1945, there were no riots in Camp Concordia. There were no demonstrations of grief or anger. A profound quiet settled over the camp. The American commander ordered that the German flag, which the prisoners had been allowed to fly alongside the American one, as per the Geneva Convention, be taken down. A small detail of German NCOs performed the task with solemn dignity. They folded the flag neatly and handed it to an American officer. That evening, the prisoners filed into the mess hall. They moved in absolute silence. The surrender had been announced. The war was over. On their trays tonight was fried chicken, corn on the cob, and chocolate cake. The same impossible abundance. It wasn't a celebration meal. It was just Tuesday. This final normal meal was the ultimate confirmation of their defeat. Klaus Richter looked at the faces of the men around him. He saw not the despair of defeated soldiers, but the exhausted resignation of men who had known this day was coming for a very long time. They had been defeated months, even years, before the final shots were fired. They had been defeated by an idea they couldn't comprehend, a system they couldn't match, and a reality they couldn't deny. They had arrived in America as soldiers of the Third Reich, believers in a narrative of national strength and glorious destiny. They would leave as something else entirely, men who understood that wars are won not on the battlefield but on the farm. They had lost the war because their enemy could do this, feed their prisoners like officers while fighting a war that spanned the globe. The physical abundance of America, which they had seen and tasted and touched, had done what bombs and bullets could not. It had broken their spirit, dismantled their ideology, and replaced it with a simple, irrefutable truth. They had never stood a chance. The war had been a matter of logistics all along, and the final bitter lesson learned in the heartland of America was that the logistics of scarcity could never defeat the logistics of surplus. The journey home was the inverse of the journey that had brought them. In 1946, the prisoners of Camp Concordia were loaded onto trains once more, heading not west into the heart of a continent, but east towards the coast, and then back to a shattered homeland. Klaus Richter, 40 pounds heavier than when he arrived, stood by the train window, watching the American landscape roll by. The endless farms, the bustling towns, the sheer, unscarred normalcy of it all. It was a country that had waged a total war without truly feeling it. He and his fellow prisoners were processed in Le Havre, France. The first thing they noticed was the hunger. It was everywhere. In the pinched faces of the French dock workers, in the desperate eyes of the children who begged for scraps. They were given their first European rations, a piece of hard black bread and a bowl of thin soup. It tasted like ash. After years of American food, their bodies revolted, but their minds understood. This was the reality they had been shielded from. This was the world their war had created. Arriving in what was left of his hometown near Stuttgart was the final shock. The city was a landscape of ghosts, of hollowed-out buildings and mountains of rubble. The smell of coal dust and damp decay hung in the air. He found his apartment block, or what remained of it. Annalise and the children were alive, living in the basement. When she saw him, she cried. But after the initial embrace, she held him at arm's length and stared. She touched his face, his arms, his stomach. "You are healthy," she said, her voice filled with a wonder that bordered on accusation. "You are fat." He could not explain it. How could he describe the mess halls of Kansas to a woman who had learned to make soup from nettles? How could he talk about apple pie to a child who had never tasted real chocolate? The chasm he had felt when reading her letters was now a physical presence between them. He was an outsider, a man who had escaped the shared suffering that had forged the national identity of post-war Germany. His health was an indictment, his survival, a form of betrayal. In the years that followed, Klaus, like millions of other Germans, dedicated himself to the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of rebuilding. He rarely spoke of his time as a prisoner. It was a strange, dreamlike interlude that nobody who hadn't experienced it could possibly understand. The other veterans he knew, those who had fought to the bitter end in Berlin or Courland, carried their physical and mental scars with a kind of tragic pride. Klaus's scars were invisible. He had been subjected to the most insidious form of re-education. He had been shown the truth. As one former prisoner of a similar camp would later say in an interview reflecting on his experience, "We didn't lose because of a lack of courage or a failure of strategy on the battlefield. We lost because they could do that. Feed prisoners like officers while fighting on 4 continents. Any nation that could afford to do that could afford to do anything. The war was over the moment I saw my first meal." Klaus Richter lived a long life. He saw his country rebuilt from the ashes, divided, and then reunited. He watched America become both an ally and a global superpower. But for the rest of his days, he carried the ghost of Kansas with him. It was there, in the way he could never bear to see food wasted. He would meticulously clean his plate at every meal and save every last crumb of bread. His children and grandchildren found it eccentric, a quirk from the old days. They didn't understand that for him, a slice of bread was never just a slice of bread. It was a symbol. It was a history lesson. It was the memory of a sun-drenched afternoon, the clatter of a garbage can lid, and the terrible soul-crushing realization that the war had been lost not in a hail of gunfire, but in a mountain of surplus food that a young American guard had dismissed with a shrug and 2 simple words: "Just garbage." The truth was, it had never been just garbage. It was the weapon that had won the war before the last shot was ever fired. Every piece of forgotten history we uncover is a piece of our own story. Subscribe now, and you won't miss the next chapter we bring to light. The stories are waiting. The legacy of the American POW camps is complex. They were part of a vast, continent-spanning network that housed over 425,000 enemy prisoners during World War II. While conditions varied, the standard of treatment, particularly regarding food, was dictated by the Geneva Convention and by America's own immense resources. For the German soldiers who passed through their gates, these camps became unintentional classrooms in American power. They came expecting the brutal, dehumanizing conditions of war, a mirror of the camps run by their own regime. They found something far more psychologically disarming: ordered, humane, and overwhelmingly well-supplied facilities. This experience did more than just keep them alive. It systematically dismantled the ideological pillars upon which their Nazi beliefs were built. They had been taught that democracy was weak and chaotic, yet they saw it organize a logistical feat of breathtaking scale. They had been told that Americans were a mongrel race, decadent and soft, yet they saw a nation capable of projecting unimaginable power across two oceans. The food was the most direct and undeniable evidence. It was a daily, tangible refutation of everything they had been led to believe. The prisoners, especially those with experience in logistics and economics, could read the story it told. A nation's true strength lay not in its rhetoric or its parades, but in its productive capacity, in its factories, its infrastructure, and most fundamentally, in its farms. When these men were finally repatriated to a defeated and starving Germany, they brought back more than just their lives. They brought back a first-hand account of the American giant. They had seen the source of its power not on the battlefield, but in the mundane details of daily life. They became, in a strange sense, unwilling evangelists for the reality of American might. While their countrymen struggled to comprehend the totality of their defeat, these former prisoners understood it intimately. They had eaten it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for years. This quiet psychological victory, won in the mess halls of places like Camp Concordia, played a small but significant role in the post-war landscape. It helped pave the way for the denazification and eventual integration of West Germany into the Western Alliance. It is easier to accept a new world order when you have already been convinced of its material and logistical inevitability. The war against the German spirit was not won by force of arms alone. It was won by logistics. It was won by the sheer, undeniable power of a nation that could afford to be generous to its enemies. It was won in the end by pot roast, mashed potatoes, and apple pie.